Well, good. I always say that it's been a privilege to be involved in the broad world of philanthropy, nonprofit efforts to improve the human situation. And I always describe myself as just a lucky farm boy from Kent County. Grew up on Orchard View Farm, a fruit farm. Went to Orchard View School, which was a two-room country school. And that was a privilege. I think the concept of the old one-room school, when grades 1 through 8, or in Orchard View it was 1 through 4 and 5 through 8, it made an ideal learning situation in so many respects. So it was great to have that experience. In those days, and that was the late 30s, 1930s, there were no consolidated high schools. We lived about 7 miles from Creston High School in Grand Rapids. And so my folks, and I had 2 brothers and a sister, and somehow we were exactly 4 years apart. So 16 years, my folks got a son and then a daughter and then a son to Creston High School, encouraged us to be engaged in post-classroom activities, and so just made that all happen, and that was a blessing. And my folks, I always marvel at my mom and dad. My grandfather, my dad's father, came from England in 1871 when he was 10 years old, and came with his maternal grandparents. And this is just background of how Russ came to be, I guess, what he is. But so they came to northern Ohio, where some of the Mawby families had come earlier and other friends, and so he grew up with family and friends in northern Ohio, completed one-room country school. Well, he was an avid learner, then went to a little school in Valparaiso, Indiana, where he got a credential in teaching. And I suppose that was 1 year or something, but then he could teach in one-room country schools, and started doing that in Ohio, then Michigan. Got married and came up to near Grand Rapids, bought 80 acres, and then began teaching in Peach Grove School. So he had an orchard and was a school teacher. My dad was the oldest son, and so he went to Peach Grove School, graduated from the 8th grade, went to work for a neighboring fruit grower, Oscar Brayman. And Oscar was a successful civic leader and a successful farmer, very much engaged in his career profession, and just said to my dad, apparently, and just encouraged him, Wes, you're bright, you ought to get more education. So in 1913, when he was 18 years old, he got on the train in Grand Rapids, had never been on a train before, got off the train in Lansing, walked 7 miles to East Lansing, and enrolled in a 10-week fruit-growing short course in the winter of 1913. Well, that changed his life, of course, because it was a whole different world that had been opened up for him. The contact with the university, with professors in fruit growing, the whole experience was dramatic. He went back and worked for Oscar until he got married, and then bought a fruit farm nearby, Orchard View Farm, that the family, my mom and dad, purchased in 1925. My mother was also an 8th grade graduate of Peach Grove School. She also was very much always interested in education and so forth. And so the family, and as I mentioned, there were 4 of us, all encouraged in school, all went through high school, then had the options of going on. I was the first to go to college, seeking a baccalaureate degree. So that was family, parents' particular encouragement that led me to have that interest. But it was also a consequence of very active involvement in the 4-H club program. My mother was a 4-H club leader, and my dad was enthusiastic about it and supported 4-H in so many ways. Both my mother and dad were engaged in all sorts of extension activities, the Extension Homemakers program for women. And so just the concept of going on to college became natural for me. Of course, my first experiences on the East Lansing campus were 4-H club work, 4-H club week, stayed in Abbott Hall, and that whole experience made you begin to think that, gosh, maybe this is something I could do. My dad also was very active in 2 state-level organizations. One, the Michigan Apple Commission, concerned with the industry, of course. And then in the late 30s, he was on the State Land Use Planning Commission, talking about land use for the future. And the 2 great initiatives that he was involved in were the Metropolitan Park System over on the east side of the state that runs from Ann Arbor all the way over to Port Huron. And the thinking about that, the Land Use Planning Commission did, and how that could come together with county participation and so forth. And the second was Yankee Springs, just south of us here, down by Hastings and Gun Lake. And so again, different experiences. Now he would go to those meetings, usually held in the Student Union building at Michigan State College campus. And sometimes he would have me go along and then just roam the campus. I suppose gave me $1 maybe so I could go to the dairy store and have an ice cream cone. But again, I began to feel at home and just the experience of being with him in those kinds of activities, talking, going down about the issues that were on the agenda, and then on the way home about what Land Use Planning Group or the Apple Commission had decided were the problems and the opportunities. So just another incredible young life experience. That led me then, of course.
During the Depression, right?
This was, it was tough times. Our community had some fruit farms, a little bit of other kind of farming, but a lot of people, were troubled with unemployment. A lot of the parents of my schoolmates at Orchard View were working for WPA or PWA, the Public Works programs. The East Belt Line was built at that time, and so you know people who were helping do that. They brought their teams and were with horses building the East Belt Line, improving 3 Mile Road down past our house. So you were aware of all of those things. And then the 4 years of high school were the years of World War II. Pearl Harbor was in the fall of my freshman year, and VE Day was just at the time of graduation in 1945. So that also tempered life on the farm because farm labor was short. My older brother was in the Navy. And so, well, of course, on most farms, we who were kids had responsibilities and roles. That was one of the blessings, really, in retrospect, because you were, at an early age, you had responsibilities. You were part of the family team to get things done, make things happen. And so, in a lot of ways, it was a blessing in retrospect to have some of those experiences. To have German war prisoners picking apples, coming from a prisoner camp at Sparta, go pick them up and bring them down for the day and so forth. Some of them could talk a little English, and so you talk about their lives back in Germany before the war. So all of those things were influences. Part of that really was my grandmother, my mother's mother, who spent her later years with us, which again was a pretty typical pattern of families at that time. Farming, of course, provided a lot of opportunities to deal with the lack of cash during the Depression. Because sure, we had chickens, we had one cow. My dad didn't like cows, and as soon as a neighbor began to bottle milk, we began to have bottled milk instead of a cow. But anyway, it was a exciting and significant period of time, a lot of lessons about the problems of others, the problems of kids who didn't have boots to wear to school in the winter. You know, and just the families couldn't afford the new jacket.
That's where I was wondering if this helped form
sure.
Who you are.
A concern
Yes.
for others.
Yes.
And just a lot, well, as a Boy Scout, I had learned first aid, and the Red Cross held training sessions for first aid in our township. My dad was one of the civilian guards for our square mile. We would have blackout drills. I tried working for it was blackout, and we would drive around to see if we could spot lights anywhere, and we'd stop and remind persons of, well, you left the light on in the Bruder house, and so forth. So all of those things, and so I was engaged as an assistant for a Red Cross worker in teaching first aid at the Grand Rapids Township Hall. And just lots of experiences that do shape your thoughts and some of your values, for service beyond self, for example. The family was a blessing in that regard. My mother and my dad were both involved, and my siblings were involved. And it was a tremendous, in retrospect, a blessed kind of growing up experience. Always encouraged with opportunities beyond. The two youth organizations that really made a tremendous contribution, each in a different way, were 4-H club work and Boy Scouts. In 4-H, my partners in the Peach Grove Rustlers 4-H club were all basically rural kids, some of them on farms, but all rural. And then I joined the Boy Scout troop, and it was in the suburbs of Grand Rapids, so I was the only farm kid in Boy Scout Troop 43, and got acquainted with kids I'd ever known, and different experiences in Boy Scouts than in 4-H. So I reflect on those experiences. And for example, in the summer of 1944, which was the last full year of the war, wasn't it before? Yeah. The Michigan Department of Conservation had a real problem because of manpower shortage of keeping up with the roadside parks and with the fish hatcheries, keeping them clean and stocked and so forth, all of those conservation responsibilities. And so they engaged the Boy Scouts to have established a camp for the summer at Higgins Lake. And Troop 43 was one of two troops that went up to set up the camp before then groups would come in for 2 weeks to do all of the jobs with Conservation Department. So one day you would be working on painting buildings, and the next day you would be knee-deep in the ponds at the fish hatchery and so forth. Just again, meeting kids, young people from other walks of life, different experiences, but a different sense of responsibility. And I would have to say that then, as more recently, I had opportunities to influence or contribute, hopefully, positively to youth development experiences. Always those experiences which I had, I thought were valuable and tried to incorporate them. I think, for example, in American society, we have prolonged adolescence for young people. You see, as a kid at 14, I had a driver's license on the farm. I don't know if non-farm kids could then, but 14-year-old driver's license. So I could take a truckload of peaches to L.V. Eberhard to his store on Eastern Avenue. I could deliver spray material up at Sparta. I could do a lot of things. And that would, so that quite different. And in all of society, I think there was engagement of youth in quite a different way than is characteristic now. And so adolescence is prolonged, I think, into the mid, sometimes late 20s for many young people. And we need to change that in a positive sense. I'm not talking about child labor. I'm talking about the opportunity to live life in a more realistic sense and to contribute through my own productivity and my contributions to others in positive ways. And it changes then not just the physical engagement, but the mental mindset and the values, which kind of then are reflected in all aspects of life. So some of those experiences really made a difference to me during those years. Typically at the Mawby household, but depending on schedules, we had breakfast together. Lunch depended on whether you were working on the farm or whether you were, and if it was on the farm, we usually had 2 or 3 hired men who also had lunch with the family. And then at supper time, we didn't have dinner except on Sunday. Supper time, we would, talk about what had gone well that day and where the problems were and what was exciting and what were plans for tomorrow. So it was in a conversational exchange and so forth. And when I was, when I was 10, Ed was 18. So he was living a different life than I was living. And that was interesting to be a part of and relate to. So that it was very much family enterprise, but pretty typical of a lot of families in our community, and a lot of community activities and projects. And the school was very much a community center with various activities which engaged family and which engaged kids of all of the ages in community participation. So the other thing that I still remember is that many of the kids in Orchard View School were first generation. Their parents came from abroad, and that usually was Germany or Italy or Poland for some reason in our community, related not to farming generally, but to the employment in town, where you had all of the furniture industry, all of the woodworking industry, and the manufacturing, starting for the auto industry and so forth. And so at home, there might be some conversation in Dutch with the Buitendijks across the road from the school, or in Polish or German, but the parents always insisted everything was done in English because their kids were Americans. And that's, again, a difference that sort of has taken place in our society, I think. So many people want to be immigrants to the United States, but they don't want to become Americans. And I think that's a change that we as a society need to be concerned about. But everybody, they had some of those traditions, and they were very often, when you had a potluck, you would have a Polish specialty, or we'd just know that they're going to bring this because that's all that was exciting.
Yeah, you bet.
So it was a wonderful, you can talk about some of the problems, but we were never poor. We didn't talk about it. And the folks managed things carefully, but we didn't have a lot of money, but we were never poor. You appreciate more in retrospect what values my parents had. We didn't sit around the table and talk about values, but you knew that, and my dad, nobody in the family ever smoked. We never had alcohol. It wasn't an issue, it just wasn't a question. It was just a part of the Mawby family. And those were always lessons learned. Went to Michigan State, majored in agriculture, and of course, more specifically in horticulture. I really thought I would be a fruit grower. I admired, my dad was an early adopter of sociologist terms. For example, many of the orchards in Sparta and around Grand Rapids had started as dairy farms. The typical family farm in Michigan had a combination of enterprise, and usually it was built around a small dairy herd, 10 to 15 cows. So you got a milk check every 2 weeks, and that was sort of a stable part. And then you might get into fruit growing, or you might raise hogs, or you might have, specialize. But it was a combination of enterprise. And so that, and even if you were a dairy farmer as your major source of income, you probably had 50 hens. So you had, if you look at farm management records of that period of time, and one of the experiences I had at Michigan State, farm management had a farm record-keeping program in which farmers kept records and sent their annual reports in, and we helped summarize them and analyze them. But, the farm would have 12 dairy cows, it would have 50 hens, it would have 2 sows for pork, you got some pigs to sell, but a couple to use at home. And so most of the fruit growers for apple storage they got out of dairy farming, changed the basement of the barn, cleaned it out, and changed it into apple storage. My dad was one of the first. We never had a big dairy barn. He didn't like cows. So as soon as we could get rid of the last cow for milk, when Hap Woodworth started bottling milk and delivering it, we got milk on the back door. We didn't have a barn to convert. My dad was one of the first to build an apple storage. Tile, insulated, and with fans and so forth. We would bring in huge pieces of ice to put in the bunkers to cool the apples in the fall. But it was a building designed for apple storage, and then it was added on, and then it was mechanical refrigeration and so forth. But then you add a packing house because the industry changed. So he was one of the pioneers in apple storage and the farm-based packing house, so that you could sell directly to supermarket systems. And then, of course, you're not old enough to remember when you went to the grocery store, you went to Johnny Hines' store on Plainfield Avenue, and my mother would go in and she would, stop, have a clerk, would take care of, and you'd ask for 5 pounds of sugar, and then you needed a box of salt, and then you needed a bag of flour, and 2 cans of peas, and the clerk would go collect all of those, and you pay for it, and he would help carry it out to your car. Well, then we began to shift to self-service, and there were 2 pioneers in this area, One was L.V. Eberhard, and that name is familiar at Grand Valley State University. L.V. was one of the first out on Eastern Avenue to have a self-service supermarket. It had a door with a light on it so that when you walked in, it opened the door. And that was a new feature. And then it had a cart and went around and picked up your own goods, and then a checkout counter. And L.V. was one of the pioneers. And another was a gentleman named Frederick Meyer, and he was at Greenville. Now, L.V. Eberhard and Frederick Meyer and their other counterparts then didn't want apples in a bushel basket. Otherwise, they had a basket of apples, and you would say, I need 3 pounds of apples, and they'd go weigh them out. So that they wanted prepackaged bags. And these were 5-pound purple mesh bags with apples in them. 6 of those bags would fit in a standard bushel crate. And so I had an early career in delivering apples to Frederick Meyer when he had 1 store at Greenville, and then a second one at Ionia, and then a third one at the corner of Fuller and just off Fuller. Where was it? Anyway. So when Fred Meyer and I see each other now, we still talk about those early days. But my dad was a pioneer in those kinds of things. So that was just another part of growing up and getting acquainted with, well, people like Fred Meyer, who was an innovator, but also had great social and societal commitment for community and so forth. Well, anyway, back to Michigan State College. Went there with a major in horticulture, specifically pomology. Now, you know that pomology is fruit growing, olericulture is vegetable growing, and floriculture is obvious. So I was a pomology major. And that was a marvelous experience. It was right after the war, and veterans were coming back and had priority on dormitory housing quite appropriately. So I lived in a little boarding house off campus for my freshman year, became a member then of the national professional and social fraternity called Alpha Gamma Rho, and moved into the fraternity house. And that was a very positive experience and a lifelong relationship in leaders in agriculture, Michigan and across the country. So that was a very positive part of life. Majoring in horticulture and doing pretty well as a student. I'll just mention, at that point, ROTC was required for freshmen and sophomore men. So I had 2 years of military. If you opted for the 4-year option, you ended up as a second lieutenant and had, I'm not sure, 2 or 4 years of service. I was just 2 years in ROTC. That again, I'd say, was a positive experience and in a lot of ways. So again, I think society needs to rethink about some of the things which maybe are, in quotes, required as a part of concern for service to all others and service to country, national, as well as sort of self-centered choices. Toward the end of my sophomore year, and I had become engaged in the college activities, particularly the College of Agriculture and in a horticulture club. Became a member of Alpha Zeta at a very early age in my college career. Alpha Zeta is the Agricultural Academic Honorary. Became involved in the Ag Council, the student group within was a reporter on the state news, the school newspaper. See, a reporter. So was engaged in college broadly. But in the spring of my sophomore year, the head of the department stopped me in the hall of the horticulture building, and I was surprised that he knew me. And he just stopped. He said, "Mr. Mawby," he was more formal. I didn't. And Mr. Mawby, could you step into my office? I'd like to speak to you. Well, you know, I wondered what's gone wrong. But he just said, "Russ, you're doing well as a student. We're proud of you. Keep that up. And we're pleased that you're a horticulture major. But I just have an idea that I would share with you for you to think about." He said, if you're really going to be a horticulturalist, as a career, you'll need to get a master's degree and probably a PhD degree. And we'll make you a specialist then. He said, I suggest you think about for your junior and senior years, you take as few courses in horticulture as we'll let you take and still be a horticultural graduate. Take as few courses in the College of Agriculture as we'll let you get by with and still have a degree in agriculture, and that you then use the freedom in your course selection that offers to sample this great university. He said, I don't have any ideas about what you study. Great religions of the world, literature, music, physics, anything, but sample this university. And I took his advice.
What was the most far away from horticulture?
I suppose, well, the one thing, I enjoyed writing, and so I really had enough credits to have a degree in journalism. At that time, they didn't have an agricultural communications major, but I did a lot of journalism work. Took courses in geography, took courses in history, beyond the requirements and so forth, and just became broadly, and similarly became more broadly engaged in student activities across the campus, one of which led to the creation in our senior year of a magazine for the combined colleges of agriculture and home economics. And it was called the MSU Homesteader. Agriculture and home economics, the whole profession of home economics was started in colleges of agriculture. And that's, I always think interesting, started in the early 1900s, like 1905, 1910, as colleges of agriculture developed extension services working with farms on farm management and farm technology and so forth. They then became concerned with improving the quality of family life on the farm and the house and interior design and experiences and foods and nutrition and clothing and so forth. And so home economics in most institutions started as a department in the College of Agriculture and then moved to college status. So it was natural then in working. So I became good friends of the dean of the College of Home Economics and department people there, and then students, and we created the MSU Homesteader magazine. For the first year, I was the editor. And so it was just another aspect of college life. So that was sort of college. Now, another great experience came about between my junior and senior year. In the 4-H club program nationally launched an international exchange program for 4-H young people. And it grew out of an initiative by 3 farm kids in the state of New York who had served in Europe in World War II and came back with a notion that people in Europe don't know us and we don't know them, and there ought to be communication. And there ought to be an opportunity for 4-H kids to go and live with families there, and for kids from there to come and live with families here. So the first year of that program was 1948, called the International, first couple of years called the International Farm Youth Exchange, but then changed to International 4-H Youth Exchange, because a lot of 4-H kids aren't farm kids. They may be rural. They can even be center city now. And so there were 17 of us from 17 different states that went to Europe in the summer of 1948. And again, that was a life-changing experience. Now, I went to the United Kingdom, mostly in England and Wales. And so language wasn't a problem. Others went to Sweden and Denmark and Italy and France and so forth. But it was a great experience in all sorts of ways. And again, influenced then my kind of course selection in my senior year following Dr. Tukey's suggestion of sample-less university, got into different kind of course selection and activities. So all of those tremendous influences of sort of growing up kind of shaped a lot of my ideas, my concerns, my priorities, the values by which I try to live. Well, yeah, I've always been concerned with the importance of relationships between people individually and relationships between people in communities to make difference, or in organizations, institutions. You have to work together to make things happen, and so I've always been engaged. I've always volunteered. Even when I was in the Army for 2 years, I volunteered, and everyone said, never volunteer. Well, you had some different experiences, and I could talk about 2 blessed years in the Army, which happened after I'd completed a master's degree and most of my PhD degree, and so I was drafted. It was the military draft. See, I still would favor compulsory public service. I would broaden it from military to all of the other. I think it'd just be great for all young people to be engaged in initiative and a contribution which can develop life skills also, but it certainly changes values and mindset about what an individual can do if she or he wishes to do with their life. So anyway, I just by pattern, again, my mom and my dad volunteered. They were, collecting for United Way in our rural community before most rural communities did anything with United Way. So I was just engaged, would volunteer, and out of that you get, I guess, identified or labeled as a leader. My description of a leader is anyone who sees either a problem that needs to be addressed or an opportunity that ought to be capitalized on, and then does something about it. And the person who's a leader in the neighborhood in providing, getting a little league ball game, a team started for kids, is quite a different person that will be concerned about how do we create better home services for the elderly. But the pattern may lead the kid who's been in Little League to be concerned about doing something for home care for the elderly. So leadership comes in all shapes and sizes and manifestations depending on the issue and the opportunity. So I saw an opportunity here to get students in agriculture and home economics working together in their courses of study, and which would frame perhaps the kinds of things they do when they become a home economics teacher, wherever that is, or simply a parent in a community concerned with whatever the issue may be. So it just has, and I still have that bad habit of not saying no as often as I ought to. My first job was with the Michigan State University in the Cooperative Extension Service. And I was an extension specialist in public policy. My horticulture degree changed to a degree, master's degree in agricultural economics. I wanted something broader. If there'd been a major in ag communications, I might have gone that way, but I went to ag economics because I then became concerned with management and marketing and those aspects. And then in my doctorate became more concerned with policy issues and the importance of policy issues nationally, all the way down locally, relate to policy decisions. Simple statement, all of the drinking water in Michigan, now this is overly simplified because you can find it, but all of the drinking water in Michigan is groundwater. It comes from underground. And underground quality is a responsibility in policy terms, not of the state of Michigan, not of the counties of Michigan, townships. And so when you want to deal with water quality and dealing with issues of pollution, for example, townships are the first players in carrying that out. So I became concerned, intrigued with all of those sort of idiosyncrasies, because here's the underground water flowing, it's lakes, it's rivers, and so it starts in your township and you pollute it and it comes to my township. There we are. And now how are we going to solve that problem? So became intrigued with all those kinds of issues. Became assistant director then. You talk about blessings of a farm kid. Became assistant director of the Cooperative Extension Service for Michigan State University on July 1st of 1956. I'd been in the Army 1953, 4, 5. Came back and picked up as an extension specialist in agricultural extension and policy issues. It was the time when farmers came under Social Security. Until then they had no retirement program. Social Security became available, and so I was involved in designing a program and educating farmers. You're 67 and you're thinking about retirement. How can you get into extension? Somebody else is 23 starting out in farming. What does he want to do about Social Security? And so that was my first opportunity after the Army. Then, to my surprise, I got a call from the dean, and I wondered what had gone awry again. Went and met with him, and he and the director of extension simply said, Russ, this was in May, we'd like to have you become assistant director of extension responsible for youth 4-H and youth programming on July 1. Well, Ruth and I talked about that and decided that'd be a wonderful opportunity, so I became assistant director of extension. And this leads me to the transition to Kellogg, because one of the problems of the extension service was getting understanding. Cooperative meant that you had some federal resources, you had the land-grant university, and then you had the county extension office. And the county usually provided support with secretarial staff for travel and operations and so forth. So having county involvement was important. And it was difficult for many people in local government and so forth to appreciate that cooperative relationship. And we needed to develop stronger agricultural leadership, farm leadership throughout the state. Young women and men engaged in farming who would become concerned with policy issues, become engaged in county or township and school board activities, etc. And so the director of extension asked two of us to think about some kind of a leadership program for the state of Michigan for people engaged in farming. And so I was one of two that had that responsibility of designing what we called a farmer's study program. And we put together a wonderful plan and sent it to the Kellogg Foundation, and it didn't go anywhere. That was just coincidence. That was the summer of 1960, spring and summer of 1964. In October of 1964, I got a call from a fellow, this is more detailed, Glenwood Creech. You talk about human relations. I'd come acquainted with Glenwood Creech in an interesting way because he was involved with the National Agricultural Extension Center for Advanced Study at the University of Wisconsin. And I won't go into detail on that, but I got a call from Glenn Creech, and he's saying, Russ, I've decided I'm leaving the Kellogg Foundation, going back to my alma mater, the University of Kentucky, and Dr. Morris, who was the president, would like to talk with you about the opportunity of coming here. And I said, oh, Glenn, gee whiz, here I am. I think my future's in the academic world. I'm enjoying it. I was a tenured full professor at age 35 or something. And I said, I just don't think it'd be fair to take any of Dr. Morris's time because I don't really think, oh, he said you ought to come down and talk with him. I said, all right, Glenn, if Dr. Morris understands that I really am not looking for a job. So I went down and had lunch with Dr. Morris and then worked there for 30 years. I was intrigued with the opportunity. As we talked about the W.K. Kellogg Foundation and what it had been and what its prospects and opportunities were for the future. And so I accepted the position. I joined the foundation on December 1, 1964 as director of the Division of Agriculture. And there were 7 program divisions, and agriculture was the one for which I had responsibility. And one of the early prospects that got reactivated was Michigan State University had a request for a farmer study program, and by golly, it got funded. And then it was replicated at 4 other states with foundation assistance, different models. And then it sort of swept the country, and there are still 37 states that have active farmer study programs based on that early model. Anyway, That's just coincidence. So I had the privilege of becoming a part of it. There were 7 program teams. Mr. Kellogg's first concern was education. Education, in his words, education offers the greatest opportunity for really improving one generation over another. And that's education of the child, but also of the parents, and the teachers, and the doctors, and on and on. So a real priority in all of the areas, agriculture and the other divisions, with education. The division of medicine and public health, division of dentistry, nursing, hospital administration, education, agriculture, and Latin American programs. And so I was one of the 7 with responsibilities in each of those areas. And you can immediately see the interrelationships. Why did agriculture come into that as a title? The first emphasis was education, sort of in the formal sense, school, elementary, secondary, but then higher education and the whole concept of a continuing education or lifelong learning. And Kellogg was very much a partner with the institutions and organizations which were engaged in that concept, but concentrating on health and then all aspects of education and learning. The real theme, if you read the history, and maybe you have, of the Kellogg Foundation, the first annual report was printed in 1941. Foundation was established in 1930. Mr. Kellogg was then 70 years old, still very active in the company, but started the foundation, and very active in the foundation. And during the first decade, they concentrated on 7 rural counties in south central Michigan. And Mr. Kellogg was personally very much active with the Board of Trustees during that period. He became essentially blind in 1941, died in 1951, so continued to be interested and engaged right up until his final trip to the hospital. So a remarkable man. He completed his formal education at age 14 and went to work selling brooms for the business that his dad had. And so just a remarkable man in the values and his vision in so many aspects of life. So learning about him has been an inspiration. He started out as a hospital administrator, quit his job when he was 46 years old and started the Kellogg Company. So that's another story, but a remarkable example in reading this. So that he and the Board of Trustees then, he formed the foundation in the spring of 1930, attended a White House conference on children and youth in Washington at the invitation of President Hoover. He had done some things in Battle Creek, came back to Battle Creek after that conference and said, well, I need to organize my philanthropy differently. So in the spring of 1930, formed the W.K. Kellogg Child Welfare Foundation, a board, a staff, just a couple of people, and began to develop their plan. Now what are we going to do? So they studied the work of other foundations, and in the annual report it says, after studying what others are doing and looking at various issues, the Board of Trustees finally made its first decision that the resources of the foundation will be essentially for the application of knowledge rather than for research or welfare, relief. I think relief was the word, either for research or relief. Research is being more generally supported from various sources, and relief, charity, is more of a responsibility of government. But the greatest challenge we see is putting to use that which is already known. We know a lot more about what good education could be than is generally practiced. We know more about what good health services could be and should be than is generally experienced. And in all of these areas, then the great challenge is to put to use that which is already known, and so here's the focus of the foundation. Started then in these 7 counties, and grew from that. Agriculture then was not a word in the mission initially, but immediately when you look at health, if you solve the problem of clean water, and that's true locally, but globally in developing countries, the pure water is the greatest source of infant death, for example. Water and then nutrition. So agriculture was really concerned with food systems and food supply. And even now we get concerns about food safety, for example. And if you buy fresh raspberries from Chile, what kind of water were they washed in, et cetera. But those are the concerns that were expressed in that first annual report. Food safety, particularly then it was raw milk.
Sure.
And
Sure.
so just fascinating to see the commonality of some of those issues. So I became a part of the team. To everyone's surprise and to my amazement, I became, 2 years later, was vice president for all programs, working under the president with all of the areas, trying to understand nursing and dentistry and so forth. And you must know how dental schools were separated. How were the problems with the mouth and teeth separated from the rest of the body? So that it's not a part of health benefits. Anyway, I began to ask questions like that, and why do we operate in such patterns of foolishness? So I became vice president for programs in a couple of years after I was there. And then in 1970, Dr. Morris retired, and I became the CEO. Had the privilege of serving as CEO for 25 years till my retirement from 1970 to 1995. So just a lucky old farm kid again, who happened to be in a wonderful situation. Yeah, so I was vice president, and Michigan, the problems going on, et cetera. But in the summer of early fall of 1969, Bill Baldwin, who was the CEO of the Kresge Foundation, invited a group of foundation leaders to a luncheon meeting at Meadowbrook Hall, and that was the great home built by Mrs. Wilson and is now a part of the campus of Oakland University. Anyway, we were invited to Meadowbrook Hall for lunch by Bill Baldwin, and Dr. Morris was going, and he invited me as vice president to go along, and that was wonderful because I met a lot of people I didn't know, and talking about what was going on in Washington in congressional hearings and decisions, which were then resulted in the Tax Reform Act of 1969. So there's just an update, and I had representative from Washington, the National Council on Foundations, I think, or lawyers and so forth, to talk about what's going on in Washington in those discussions. That was all new to me because I was in agriculture and the foundation, and then had this broader responsibility and trying to figure out how do you get the nurses to talk differently and work differently with physicians and vice versa, and et cetera. So I was learning about all of those things and engaged in a variety of issues. Had started under agriculture. You see, this is where I never wanted a I never wanted a very specific job description. I wanted to know what I was expected to do, but then I wanted the freedom to do also what else ought to be done. So I didn't want too narrow a fence. And I talked about that with Dr. Morris way back when he bought lunch, before I made a decision. Anyway, that led us, for example, to a first national initiative on the part of foundations to work with the 1890 land-grant universities segregated. So in 13 states, a second university, they had a land-grant university like MSU, they had North Carolina State University, but then, and that was the Extension Service, but North Carolina A&T was the black land-grant university. So, learned all about that, and most of the rural kids who were going to, foundations had worked with the private universities like this Atlanta group, Spelman and Meharry and so forth, none with the public universities. But if you looked at black students, the numbers were at the public universities, and with the civil rights legislation of the mid-60s, the opportunities for those universities and those young people changed dramatically. So, as Director of Division of Agriculture, I invited myself to 7 of those institutions, and we didn't do anything in agriculture. We did it in engineering and library science, wherever they saw opportunities that their institution ought to now be thinking of training their graduates for. So, you see, there's that's not agriculture at all, but it's rural kids, and it's their future. So, anyway, went to this meeting and learned about the issues which were being discussed in Washington, which resulted in the Tax Reform Act of 1969. A lot of the provisions of the act just right on target, very necessary, very good. There were some that were troublesome. So, and I suddenly became, that passed in 69, in 1970, in the summer really, I became president, and then with the title of CEO on September 1 of 1970. And immediately concerned then about the implications, because what are the aspects of that act that Kellogg is concerned about? We want to endorse, or we want to support those positive elements. One of them, for example, accountability. A lot of foundations wanted to operate in secret, you know, right know how we operate and what we do, et cetera. Foundation, Kellogg for years, the first one was 1941, but then an annual publication, dissemination, and accountability and so forth, so that we wanted to be positive in the support of the legislation, which we thought were right on target in terms of public policy. But we also wanted them to have a capacity to respond to those which we thought needed to be reconsidered or refined. And so suddenly I was in a different chair. So I called Bill Baldwin and said, Bill, you know, I'm concerned with this. We in Michigan in the foundation don't know each other. We'd never had a meeting. You had that nice luncheon. But I think we ought to have a second meeting, invite all we can. There was no list of foundations. But we find as many foundations as we can and follow up in some way. And he said, that's a wonderful idea. And I said, well, why don't you go ahead and say, I'll be glad to help. But he said, I did the last luncheon, you can do this one, Russ. Well, he was very senior in every way. And so I said, okay, will you be on the committee with me? He said, sure. So you see, I didn't say, no, I won't do that. I said, sure, I'll do that. So began to identify a group, and we got about 10 of us together, and I hope there are records that give you some of those details. But we had lunch, talked about this need, and decided, yes, we had about 10 in the planning group, but we had private foundations, and we had some family foundations that didn't have the kind of visibility of Mott and Kellogg and Kresge and a few others. There were a few community foundations in Michigan, and so Howard Callaward was in the group, Kalamazoo, and some corporate grant makers with the Ford Motor Fund, Ford Motor Company Fund, which is not the Ford Foundation. The Ford Foundation's in New York, and the Ford Motor Company Fund is in Michigan. So we drew together, tried to get a leadership group together. And we talked about this, and we decided that we needed to hold a meeting of broader involvement, identify and then invite, but to announce publicly so anyone interested in the foundation concept and participation would be welcome. And that this would be a meeting of two purposes. We wanted substance to talk about TRA 69 and the various components and the positives and how we help make that happen. And the area, for example, of payout was one concern, because payout was to be, the payout requirement was to start, I think, at 5%, but was to be established and announced annually by the Secretary of Treasury. And it would be related to the interest rate on Treasury bills. And I'd be more specific than that. But that started to go up, and it eventually went up to 12 and 13%, which would be disastrous in a payout requirement on a private endowment. So we wanted to talk about substance then, the things that we thought everybody ought to react to positively, and then how we then can address other issues. So we decided on having a conference of Michigan foundations, and we needed a committee. And Russ, since you combined this group, you could just be chairman of that committee, and we'll work with you. We need to broaden it, get some other participation, but we'll plan the first conference of Michigan foundations. Interestingly, it ended up a CMF conference, and it may have had that for a couple of years. But one of the activities at the first session, which was held at Schuler's Restaurant and Hotel in Ann Arbor, there was a motel or hotel, and Schuler's had the restaurant, and so we met there. But I had become acquainted with a guy named Phillips, Dr. Phillips. What was his first name? Anyway, he had been a sociologist at Michigan State, and he was engaged in community development activities and so forth. And he had a discussion technique of if you had a large group, you get groups of six people around a table, and then you'd have a question for them, and they had 6 minutes to discuss it. So it was the Phillips 66 method. And that's when we had Phillips 66 gas. So this was the Phillips 66. So at the meetings then, the luncheon meetings where we had people around the table, each luncheon meeting had a different question that they talked about and then fed back into the discussion, which dealt with questions of should we have a conference next year? Should we have another conference, or is this good enough to do again? Secondly, should we think about some sort of an organization of Michigan foundations ongoing? And third, if we had such an organization, how could it be funded, and how could we have a sustainable pattern? I think those were the three basic questions that we dealt with. So we ended up at the end of the meeting saying, yeah, we're going to have a committee. We're going to have a conference. We need a committee, and people could volunteer for the committee. And so we have a committee to plan the conference, and we'd have another committee to look at what kind of a structure it could be, and a third one, how could it be funded? So that led to then those committees and to the planning of the next conference. So that's sort of how CMF began. And we had foundations chipped in, Russ could call Bill Baldwin, and he could call the Mott Foundation and so forth. And Herb Dow was very active, and of course that's Dow and that's Randy Reeker. So we got funding to have a part-time staff to help us, the committee, in planning the second one and so forth. Grew from there. And then the part-time person moved to California, and we needed somebody. And there was a young lady, she was just a kid, who had come to the first meeting. she was a member of the board of trustees of the Grand Haven Community Foundation. And her name was Dottie Johnson. And I'm sure I'm factual on that. You've talked to her, but she came to and she became engaged in the planning and so forth. And it was just obvious then, if Dottie was available, she should be our executive director. And she agreed to do that. She had 2 little girls. I think they were still elementary, maybe preschool, kids, the little girls. And she said, but the office would have to be in Grand Haven. We can't disturb that. Mart has his business and his career. That's where we're living. We want the kids to go to school here. So if the office can be in Grand Haven. So the office is in Grand Haven. And a couple of foundations there helped make that possible. Engagement, and so CMF, that's where it all started.
What would have happened if you all had just operated individually, if you just stayed on doing what you were doing? Can you imagine that, or can
no,
you?
well, you can, but it would be chaos. We still have some policy issues at the national level. We've got some new ones at the state level, and it would be desperate. Situation if not. Now, CMF started with sort of a focus upon services for members, the conference, and then educational, et cetera. Then became more engaged and structured to address policy issues, became a player at the national level, both in terms of encouraging people from Michigan to become members of the Council of Foundations Board so that we're engaged, but then active in those activities, and leaders in, for example, pioneers and what is Foundations on the Hill. We did that as Michigan first, and then the Council of Foundations said, can't we get other states to do the same kinds of things? So Michigan has CMF has been the pioneer, the leading RAG, Regional Association of Grant Makers in the country, just marvelous. And then you see they began to be concerned, how could we get foundations engaged and established to serve, so we can say every community in Michigan has the potential. And talked about a challenge grant. And that's where somebody said, well, that's an interesting idea. I think we could be interested in that, but it would be particularly exciting if we figured out we could get younger people involved. And then I probably said, I was driving a truck when I was 14. And we ought to give kids an opportunity to be engaged. They're marvelously responsible. You just look at this. And so that was the Youth Advisory Council. And that was another dimension that worked. A lot of people, I can remember Byron Cook in Montcalm County, Greenville, saying, we would never have gotten our foundation going if we hadn't had YAC. That got us as adults going, and it just happened.
What I think is so remarkable is how many, you have prepared this next generation of leaders, of community leaders, of civic
community leaders. And then you see, the CMF said on some of these things, we need to have research. Does YAC make a difference? And that's a longitudinal study, and so you follow to see what happens. I'm a yacker when I'm 16,
That's right.
and then I become more active, then I go to college, then I go to work. What happens then? And it's just so remarkably evident that those experiences do change. It may not change your career. You may still go into engineering or business or teaching or whatever, but then what you do in your career, personally you're engaged, you volunteer, but then you also get others volunteered, and so it just makes a difference in how you handle both your career, the way you earn a living, and secondly, how you live a life. And there's a difference.
And the ripple effects in the community.
Yeah, whole thing.
What that does to community after community after community.
Yeah, the multiplier, the so-called ripple effect is incredible. So that's sort of how CMF came about. And the difference between the Council of Michigan Foundations and the Council of Foundations at the national level is, I think, the greater participation, quite understandably, in the state organization. That if you go to the national meeting of the council, most, not all, but most of the participants are staff of foundations. And you get a few family members and so forth that are engaged, and they become active at the national level. The state conference, you have those foundations which do have staff, community foundations and other foundations. Staff come, but you have a lot of the donors and their family and trustees. Not all trustees of foundations are donors to the foundation, but they're on the foundation board, community or private foundation. And they come to those meetings, and it changes the nature of that, and then builds capacity to reinforce, for example, policy initiatives at the community level and at the state level. And so the role of CMF, I think, has become more significant with experience as we learn to respond to both new challenges, problems, or new opportunities. Mm-hmm. And you look dramatically, the whole concept of learning to give, which is I think, ingenious. We're still struggling with getting it to expand to its full potential, but that's a CMF initiative.
What are the issues facing CMF in the 2011, 2012, 2013 world?
Well, you know, I'm chair of the advisory cabinet of CMF, and I describe it as the meeting of has-beens, because everybody there has been a member of the CMF board. So we're the has-beens. And I dramatically am a has-been because, you know, that's a lot of changes since I retired in 1995. I'm on the CMF board, but not actively engaged. I appreciate the way I communicate and get the minutes and so forth. But so they're much more sensitive. But I just think that one of the things at both the national and state levels is the absence of understanding and support for the importance of the nonprofit sector. And they can say glibly and in their grand rhetoric that we're going to cut expenses and you know, somebody else is going to pick up expense for the homeless, expanding health care to those who don't have health care, to expanding opportunities, all of the things you look at. I say simply that we as a society have to understand the role of three sectors. The first is the nonprofit business sector. That's the economic generator for the support of everything else that happens. And so the private for-profit sector has to be recognized as the heart of our society. It's the economic generator, and without generating resources, you don't have the resources for the public sector to do it. And we need government. We need government, public institutions and services at the local level, in the city and the county and the state and the national level. And so we recognize the role of government sort of goes ebbs and tides. It rises and it shortens and so forth. But certainly the role and the impact on the daily life of each of us, of government, is so much greater than when I was a kid, for example, or than it was 20 years ago, that we need to recognize that as a society. And some of that is very positive, and some of it I question whether that's a proper role for government. So there's that debate. The third sector is the nonprofit sector. And if you look at life at the community, where life is lived by most of us, Now, some of us, our community is much different, but for a lot of people, the community is fairly narrow and fairly restricted. They may travel a little bit, but life is pretty local. But in any event, life is lived at a community level, and much of the character and the quality of life at the community level is determined by the nonprofit sector. But that requires collaboration between the nonprofit sector with the public sector, and both of them have to have the resources generated by the business sector. So the connections are inevitable, necessary, vital, and generally positive. But right now, in the state legislature, we do not have a lot of understanding of the importance and the role of the nonprofit sector. And so we do away with tax credits. And that's just one little piece of the whole problem of the budget. And we've been indulging and living beyond our means, not as badly at the state level as at the national level. But to think then that we can quit doing and not be concerned about the consequences of the decisions we make in the legislature, the governor's office, that the consequence of those will be felt in every community as the impact is felt. So I think that's probably the biggest challenge. But that's a lack of understanding and real appreciation for that as you meet as a legislator or as a governor dealing with the horrendous problems which that office has. So, and then so one is that relationship to support in public policy regarding finance. And at the national level, I understand that's one of the things they're talking about in this big committee of 12. And it's an incredible consequence that 2 of the 3 House representatives on that group are from Michigan.
Yes.
And pretty well informed about what CMF's done and so forth. So hopefully they will have understanding of that. But I think that's, in general, there's a problem of articulating the nonprofit sector and having people understand what it is and where it is and what it does, because a lot of what it does, in a sense, is invisible to other than the direct beneficiaries.
Just until you need it, until somebody needs it.
Church.
Yes.
You know,
Yes.
that's, see, all the activities of church. Well, if you look at the life at the community level, all of our religious activities, much of the enrichment of education, the things beyond just the classroom and so forth, are nonprofit contributions, youth services, most of the arts, the cultural activities, the list, so many aspects of health programs, particularly when you look at individuals, particularly who don't have resources to get the services they need, et cetera, et cetera. So the consequences of a decision simply well, we've got this whole list of tax credits, we'll eliminate them all. A lot of them I don't think have a justification, but I think the support of the work of nonprofit organizations, and most people don't think of what churches do and our local symphony, and on goes the list. They don't recognize that those are nonprofit organizations under the conceptual framework and the legal structure. So CMF, you have the continuing challenge of trustee recruitment and training, engagement of different populations that are traditionally involved as they ought to be, providing exciting opportunities for youth. All of those things are still on the agenda, but some of the public policy issues at this point, it seems to me, are the particularly troublesome ones, both, and Michigan will suffer the consequences or the benefits of national decisions in addition to decisions at the state level. We were the first state, for example, to have a tax credit for community foundations. Others have followed our example, and now we don't have it anymore. And so those are the challenges. I'm glad we've got bright young people on the CMF board and staff really dealing with some of those issues in very impressive and substantive ways. It's compounded in Michigan by term limits because everybody goes in, their first concern in their first term is to get elected to the second one, and then to get elected to the third one. Then that's success. And then I guess if you can get any final gunshot for your local community, you've really been a hero. That doesn't necessarily relate in good public policy. Well, it seems to me that if you look at society globally, the greatest challenge is human relationships. And how do we get along one with another? Now, if you go to the other extreme, from the global society and its human relationships, you go to the unraveling of families at the individual and local level. That's the other extreme. You see, it's about social relationships, and it's a matter of relationships, communications. And as you look then at all of the issues which confront us, the tough issues, human relationships have become tremendously important. And so I think we just need to have a continuing commitment to the engagement of people in as positive ways as we can. And I was pleased when the Kellogg Foundation agreed to be a major partner in creating the National Institute for Global Ethics, and Rushworth Kidder as the leader of it. And out of that work, he helped me define the values which I think about continually as I make decisions about our own family engagement and generosity. And I come down to 5 values, and I even use these in thinking when I sit in church and think about what Russ ought to be doing as a Christian. I think about these values. I get overwhelmed when I try to think about the biblical leaders and so forth. That's all interesting. But I say, you see, as an old farm boy, what do I do?
What are those 5 values?
Okay, 5 values. First one is honesty. You got to be honest. And there's no worse, there's no greater detriment to human relationships that I can't trust you, or you can't trust me. So you got to be honest. Second is caring, compassion. You got to care about others. You can't be self-centered. You got to care about, I'm my brother's keeper. You bet I am, or ought to be. And so you've got to care. And as you think of decisions that are made of all kinds that are sort of uncaring and without a sensitivity to the other perspective and point of view. The third is respect. Now, I don't necessarily agree with you, Susan, but I can respect your point of view. And we can talk about it civilly, and I can respect you, and I respect people of other religions. I respect people of other color, obviously, and et cetera, et cetera. So you've got to be respectful of others in all of your relationships. Fourth is responsibility. I got to be responsible for self, my own behavior, my own conduct, how I spend my time, how I perform my job, and how I work together with those who are engaged with my work. I got to be responsible for the way in which I conduct myself in society, and I've got to be responsible for trying to help others be responsible also, that they're appropriately engaged in assuming their responsibilities and aren't just working the system. And the fifth is fairness. Try to be fair in decisions. And all of these, you see, some of these you can't quantify statistically. And what is fair? But you try to be fair as you consider all the aspects of a decision, an action, or whatever that has to be taken. I think Rushworth Kidder, I hope I don't do him any injustice, would say that as he, this all started out of his study literally going around the world and trying to find out. It's easy to identify the issues that cause us to be antagonistic one to another, or to be difficult. You can find all of the causes of friction and problems. But are there some areas in which humankind can agree? And he would say those are the 5 values that he finds in all kinds of cultures, nationalities, etc. I think that's an accurate summary. He's tried to work with all sorts of groups, including now youth as well as adults, but talks with corporate executives, talks with people in government. You know, simple ethical question. How could I as a member of Congress say that I ought to have a different retirement program than I supported for the whole population? How can I as a member of Congress say I should have a better, obviously, more generous health program for myself than we provide to all citizens? The list goes on, but that's an ethical issue to me. And so I just find those 5 values, you know, as you try to deal with what role you have, what relationship you have when you're in a church council meeting talking about tough decisions because their budget's short. What are we going to do? You know, how do we deal with it? So those, I'm just a simple kid from a farm who tries to deal with life in a positive way.
Tell that to somebody else, Mr. Mawby. Mr. Dr. Mawby.
Yeah, Mr. Dr. Mawby. Just call me Russ. Yeah. Well, you can't be around me or invite me to speak when you won't hear me say something about, in the final analysis, only people are important. People make a difference. That I had the privilege, you know, of being involved in philanthropy. The most important decision you make is the identification of the grantees, because it's the people whom you empower with just money who have the more important ingredients in dealing with problems. They're the ones that are living with it, they're trying to make it happen, and a little money will help them make it happen. Usually, it should happen anyway if they really mean it. It will happen anyway, but take longer and can't implement it as successfully as they can with assistance. So you're looking always at people. And I don't know why it doesn't happen in other states. It just seems that you know, that it's so obvious that if things are going to happen, people have to communicate and they have to decide and they have to work together. And so in those efforts that I've been involved with, it's simply a matter of getting people engaged to understand and to do something. So I don't know why, but it's obviously that there hasn't been someone who really tried to kick the can down the road. That's the word in today's, isn't it? Kick the can down the road in the most productive and positive way in terms of human values and consequences.
I noticed you used the word engaged.
Yeah.
It really means more than just get involved, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, you have to be committed, and you have to believe in the cause, whatever that is. You have to be willing to obviously commit yourself, and that's more than money. It's time and talent, whatever we have, time, talent, and treasure, yeah, but that really means engaged. And if you're on the board of an organization, you have to help make it happen. And it's interesting in states that people who, I'll say, who are really making their livelihood at philanthropy aren't making some of these things happen. And I don't have a good answer for that. At the present time, I'm only on one board where I have a vote. I'm on 2 or 3 boards where I'm chairman emeritus. That means I can come and I can have coffee and even have lunch, and I can talk, but nobody has to listen, because Russ can't. No, I'm being facetious, but I'm engaged in a number of initiatives that are to me tremendously important.
And what are those?
Well, they're the kinds of issues we're talking about.
Okay.
There's an organization in Battle Creek called the CIR, Community Inclusive Recreation, engaging people with problems, the handicapped, physically, mentally, emotionally, to engage them in positive ways in the larger community where so many of the opportunities are limited to them. I've engaged with the Sherman Lake YMCA Center down the road from us, because they have 4 words that they use, 4 of my 5. They say fairness is incorporated the other place. But they have camping programs, and they have the typical Y program, but now they're particularly working with school groups in which the teacher and the class come for 3 or 4 days. And it's a nature setting, and so you talk about nature a little bit, but it's not science and nature, it's relationships. And it's the citizen of responsibility. If you look at what our schools are doing, the whole education hierarchy from the national level are increasingly emphasizing in education earning a living. And now they're making the standards of education on 3 things which can be statistically measured. One is reading. They can test me, and yeah, he can read and understand and do this, or he flunks, but you know, you can do that. You can do it in math, obviously, and you can do it in science. But you can't have those statistical measures for the most important elements of living a life. And we used to really concentrate, I think, in the early elementary years. I had a wonderful sister-in-law who taught kindergarten for 43 years. And the real goal, she said, was this is the first time the kids are away from home. We've got to learn to work for each other. I've got to learn to hang up my coat and do whatever those responsibilities. I've got to help each other. We've got to be nice to each other. We learn to play together. We learn to work together, do things. But now you don't give a teacher of the elementary grades any credit at all for making Russ a good kid and making Susan a good kid who you aren't pushing alphabet. You may do a little bit of alphabet. You aren't pushing math, but you may learn to count and so forth. Now they're talking about even the alphabet and mathematics in preschool programs. And I think it's a consequence of that de-emphasis upon the importance of these human components that are causing riots in high school, for example. So that's what Sherman Lake is working on. The evidence is increasingly clear that teachers say that after we have that experience in which we work together, and they'll say, I now deal with my class differently than I did before. And when my new class comes in, I treat them differently than I did before I had this kind of experience, and how we can learn to help one another, and you have games and so forth and so on. I think we're missing that as a society, and the consequences are becoming increasingly evident. And the subtle changes in which we've got families now, in which I think you can document the 5th, 6th, 7th generations who've never earned a living. I was on the board of Star Commonwealth for Boys. That's the boys' state of Michigan, a marvelous program. Takes kids by court referral. And most of them you talk with these little guys, and they come at age 10 or 14 or 15. They've not been in a family that has breakfast or supper together. They'll come home from school and there's no adult there, and they may not see an adult until they go back to school the next day. Incredible, desperate kinds of situations. And but we as a society just aren't addressing that, and I'm disappointed. I was on the school board for 4 years, way back when my kids were still in school. And I used to say to the educators, why has education set up standards which force the school board to make the wrong decisions? And they say, oh, what do you mean by that? I said, well, whenever resources are short, you come to us and say, well, we solve that by increasing the class size in the elementary. And so instead of 18, we'll go to 22. We do away with special music. We do away with special reading. We do away with special art. Why? We got to keep our high school accredited so we can get an accredited college. But all of the research says the early years are the most important. And if you really believed your research, you'd accredit the elementary school, because you know that if those youngsters don't have some adequate capacity in reading particularly, and in math and thinking and decision making, by some could say the third grade, the fifth grade, but some, they probably won't graduate from high school. And yet the whole system is disoriented based upon what we know. If we really research, high school wouldn't start at 7:45. It'd start at 10:30.
That's right.
But we shifted. You see, it used to start at 8:30 or 9 o'clock when I was a kid, and now it's earlier. Why? So a very small percentage can go out for track and football and volleyball. The whole thing is distorted. Does it make any sense? The school year is wrong, we know that. It was established in 1835 by Horace Mann in Massachusetts with an agrarian society. Start classes in the fall when potatoes are dug, and quit classes in the spring when it's time to plant corn. It was an agrarian society. We lived on farms. Kids were part of the farm team. More completely then than when I was a kid. But that's still the school year. And so we've got those problems, and those are the things that I find troublesome. Now I'm wandering off from what...
It's okay. No, we want to hear what you have to say.
So those, as I said, I'm less engaged, so I'm very sensitive to that. But these are the kinds of things which concern me. Well, some of the people who've been, see, I always say I had the privilege of being a part, but what really ever happened with grants happened in the organization, the institution, not me. So, some of the exciting things one obviously would be the Youth Advisory Council. And you can think about so many examples. A crazy decision to help Costa Rica develop Earth. And Earth is an acronym for the EAR. It's the Agricultural Institute for the Humid Tropics.
Oh my gosh.
It's a land-grant university in Costa Rica. USAID had great programs.
Yes.
And Costa Rica had compiled quite a reservoir of $50 or $60 million of aid fund that they wanted to use to create an agricultural school for the humid tropics. And they couldn't use any of the money to plan such an institution. So they came with us with a crazy question: could you help us plan this institution? Well, that's not normal procedure. But we did. And we not only did, we helped them identify Glenn Taggart as a retired president of Utah State University and 3 or 4 other experts. And we had been programming in agriculture in Latin America for a long time, in the US. And Earth is a model institution now. And an effort now going on to try to replicate something of the same model in Africa, bringing young women and men from rural communities into a setting of learning agriculture, learning skills of relationships, of organization to make things happen. Because you not only have to know the technology of growing corn or cassava or chickens, you need to convince people that this is a better way to do it,
right.
and how it will benefit your family and so forth. So you've got to have the technical knowledge, but you've got to have more than that, and you've got to be a leader. And so that's why it's interesting. If you look at what the Kellogg Foundation did in the leadership area broadly, concerned with leadership always, and I'll have to go back to the farmer study program that Russ Mawby said, we got to do something different about farm leadership, not only just for the industry, but for their broader part in community, because they need to be supportive of education and health services and so forth, and not just corn yield rates. Well, let's talk about Southern Africa. The foundation geographically started out in 7 counties in south central Michigan. Then World War II came along. The State Department came to the foundation world, invited foundations, and Kellogg went to a meeting in Washington convened by the Department of State. And simply they said, we of course don't know how the war is going to come out in the South Pacific or in Europe. We hope we'll be victorious. But regardless of what happens, the Western Hemisphere, North and South America, will have common interests. And we'd like to, and South America is not directly engaged in either of those conflicts. Would you think about ways in which U.S. and South America could be involved? And the Kellogg Foundation stepped up immediately with a fellowship program to bring young professionals, specifically in the health fields, medicine, dentistry, nursing, hospital administration, public health. No universities in South Africa had advanced programs, graduate programs in those fields, and we had them here. So bring them here. This was the foundation's initiative to bring them here. You got a young nurse in Bogota. The Department of Nursing wants to expand in pediatric nursing. So you identify this young person and you send them to the University of Michigan, School of Nursing, specific purpose, graduate degree, pediatric nursing. The faculty here knows that. They know that's her program. Her research is going to be done in Bogota, so it's relevant. Her faculty may go to Bogota and get that link going. She goes back, starts the program, continues that relationship. The fellowship was really awarded to the Department of Nursing for that person to come. So what do we call it? The rate of non-return, was virtually zero, because everybody knew, and she knew, that she was going to go back with this job to do this task. Most of the people who came on fellowship didn't want to go home, but we had zero erosion of that. So that started us in South America. And then the foundation, after the war, continued in South America and the US and Northern Europe. Northern Europe was concerned about the quality of rural life, about the fact that their agriculture, their food system, they weren't able to feed themselves, and the quality of life in rural communities. So we had 30 years of engagement there. In 1980, we began to phase out our European involvement, we increased our activities in Latin America, and we had been studying, thinking, talking about Africa. And we're thinking about how can we get engaged in a significant way, but you can't look at the whole economy, the whole continent without being overwhelmed because of all of the problems. Well, simultaneously, the Kellogg Company, which Mr. Kellogg started and on which the success of the Kellogg Foundation was really based, and still is, the Kellogg Company was getting shareholder requests to divest. All American corporations should get out of the Republic of South Africa because of apartheid. Get out, And Bill DeMoth was our president. I was on the board of the Kellogg Company because we were voting a third of the stock at that time. So it was an important shareholder responsibility which I had. Bill DeMoth said, we're getting these requests to get out of South Africa. He said, we started in South Africa in 1946 in a small way. We now have 450 employees. We've done more than the Sullivan Principles, which Reverend Sullivan had set up. We've done more than that. We're engaged in the village with helping with housing, with mortgages. We're helping with schools. We're helping with health services. We're the first company in South Africa to recognize a black employees union. We have blacks at all levels. They're working in the factory. They're truck drivers. They're in finance. They're in public policy. They're in the whole company. He said, if we sell, he said, and the scale of the doesn't make that much difference to the company. I don't know, a couple of percentages. It's not that great. He said, but I've been there and given these folks 25-year pins. I can't do that because if we sell, all of that will disappear. We'll have to sell either to a South African company or to a German or Japanese. And he said, I can't do that. So I'd like to have 2 members of the board go, 3 members of the board go to Republic of South Africa, meet with anybody. We'll set it up to meet with people in government, people in business, anyone you want to do. And he asked 3 people. He asked Pete Estes, who was the retired president and CEO of General Motors, who had been engaged in South Africa. Paul Smucker, the jam and jelly guy, who just a remarkable human being, and me. And so we met with the South African representatives of the embassy in Washington. We met with the Department of State. We talked with all sorts of folks. We went to South Africa. And it was such a different and revealing experience. We visited the village where the workers lived. We talked with the officers of the employees union. We talked with ministers of government. We talked with lots of folks. And we recommended that the company stay because they were making a difference. And I remember the president of a huge sort of the A&P or Kroger's or Walmart now of South Africa in the grocery stores. He said, I can do things. I've integrated my facilities for staff. I give them opportunity. He said, I couldn't do that if I couldn't say, I've got to do it because of Kellogg and other companies that are doing these things. We've got to do it. He said, if you go, I have less of a case and the government will force me to do what I don't want to do. And so anyway, we simultaneously had talked with our board of trustees about Africa. We'd been talking about it. So came back and said, we recommended, the 3 recommended to the company board that they stay, that we stay, the company stay in South Africa, which the company continued to do. And then to the foundation board, I said, well, you look at apartheid, apartheid is wrong. Apartheid will end. There's no question about if, it's when and how. How quickly can it happen? How can it happen without violence or negative consequences as well as positives? And the reality is there simply need to be more blacks trained to assume the responsibilities which will become available to them. and that means higher education. Over there they call it bursaries, scholarships. And the evidence was clear. All of the major universities were already integrated, and that there were more blacks qualified for university entrance than they had support for. And so we set up a major program of bursaries, and that we would, but I said that when we're talking with people there, they say, well, foundations have come, and a group of 6 will come, and we'll host them and talk, and they go home and we hear nothing. So I said, that's not Kellogg. So we told one of our vice presidents, went to South Africa with $5 million to commit to bursaries. We selected the areas of the health professions broadly, education, food systems, farming, agriculture, rural problems, business administration, and public administration. And that we would support students in those majors through completion of the degree, so long as they made progress. So that the vice president, our representative Kellogg, could sit down with the president of the university, talk with the staff and the relevant colleges, whatever, and end up with a handshake saying, okay, we have 15 bursaries starting next semester. And so we went in very quickly. That was the fall of 1985. I went there in February 1985. Came back with these recommendations, so we went back over and got those commitments. So the next semester, the students could be starting. And of course, apartheid ended more quickly than anyone anticipated. Ended really in 1990. And already some of those students were beginning to be prepared for responsibilities, public agencies of government, public administration, in business, and then in those 3 areas of emphasis. So that's how we moved very quickly. Well, that brings us to the whole broad area of leadership. If you look back, the foundation has been involved. It was interesting, in those 7 counties, for example, it was always the application of knowledge, and the knowledge source generally is universities. So they had close relationships to the University of Michigan, obviously, in medicine, in education, nursing, public health, hospital administration. So back in the 30s, Michigan State then had education broadly and agriculture, rural development. And the third was the University of Chicago, a prestigious university. Again, health professions. So they would load on the train here, school board members, hospital board members, Department of Public Health board members, and professional staff, and go to Chicago, or go to East Lansing, go to Ann Arbor. And that was a kind of leadership development. One of the interesting results of that was the concept that continuing education, lifelong learning was always an interest of the foundation. But what do you do with a group of adults who are coming in for 4 days to look at health services? Where do they stay and how they convene? So, university-based residential center for continuing education. The first one was at East Lansing, then Georgia, Oklahoma, Chicago, Nebraska, New England, Columbia. Anyway, and now that concept is just multiplied. You see those kinds of facilities at universities all across the country and beyond. So that grew out of that Michigan Community Health Program in the 30s. So always leadership, but I became very concerned as we were programming in our various areas of responsibility of the benefits of specialization in healthcare, specialization now in early childhood education. So specialization is important. And so we'd get requests from bright young women and men in various institutions, organizations, communities, but they would do a great job of describing the problem, the issue with which they were concerned, but their solution then that they proposed was usually sort of prescribed by the narrowness of their profession. And it wasn't broad enough to engage and deal with the broader problem. Because the reality is that none of the things that really concern us can be dealt with by any one specialty. You got them to get together. And so if you look at groundwater, for example, sure, that's the quality of drinking water for the state of Michigan. You got to have the technical, so you got to know about percolation rates and the degree of pollution caused by this and that. And you got to have all of that. And where are the underground flows of water? Oh, you got to have that all that science. But the political decisions start at the township level and go to the state level. So you got to engage them. So you have to get engaged with government officials and public health officials and the general population and so forth to deal with it. So you have to have a broader approach, and that's true with every significant problem. So we were concerned, how do you benefit from specialization, and how do you prepare the specialists to be leadership and be leaders in a broader sense? And so that conceptualized the Kellogg National Fellowship Program in 1980 as an observance of the 50th anniversary of the foundation. So we started KNFP, and the concept was to get release time for bright young professionals, to bring them together and provide a variety of experiences. You wanted a mixture within that study group. The group was about 50 in number. You wanted women and men, you wanted racial diversity, you wanted demonstrated specialization. They had already earned some degree of recognition of credibility, whether it's in sociology or nuclear physics or business administration, whatever. Yeah, the easiest source was usually academic institutions and then nonprofit organizations. All sorts of details of government restrictions which made it difficult to get people out of government into the KNFP, and difficult also out of business, but we had various degrees of success. This was a 3-year commitment, and about a quarter of the time of the person. And each of them, in addition to participating in the group activities, had to develop a personal project to which they were committed, but it had to be different from their specialty. Could be related in some way, but could be completely different. Mm-hmm. So if your specialty is in theology, you may study environmental issues. Mm-hmm. If I'm in nuclear physics, I may want classical music. Mm-hmm. And so you had to get outside your area of expertise. Tremendous experiences, and you can remember first time on a farm for these folks, and you look at this tractor, which is planting corn, and its planting mechanism is hooked to a computer and a satellite hookup. And this field of 40 acres we've harvested last year, and we've got the records, so that here is where you need to apply more fertilizer than you do down here, and it's all programmed into that planting machine, and they say, you know, this is farming. Yeah. At the other extreme would be spending a night in the emergency room at a big metropolitan hospital, and the problems of people, desperate problems, homeless, no resources, sick kid, where do you go? Or problems of addiction and violence and so forth. They just saw a sector of society, of humanity, that they'd never seen before. So that was KNFP for 18 groups. I always met with them in the initial group. The average age tended to be in the early to mid 30s. because we wanted, they had to have a degree of maturity and credibility and so forth so in their profession. But we wanted then the longevity. So, and you can hear me talking about get them younger. You don't have to wait till they're tenured.
That's right.
Right in their lives now. I always met with the first session of each group and simply talked about the concept. This is what we're here. This is why we're, and this is an opportunity for you to indulge yourself intellectually. Indulge. So each of them had a resource in addition to the group opportunity to travel, and they would get subgroups, go to Europe or go to China or whatever. And so an incredible experience, and the longitudinal evaluation, assessment of that is incredible. So that was a major initiative. But then we also, now you have to realize that at that point in time, incredibly, the concept of leadership was not universally accepted because you're born to leadership. That's the old European model. And unless your ancestors were dukes and lords and ladies, no chance for you to be a leader, you know? And so the remnants of that still, you know, if you're not born to a family of substance and of expert, you know, no possibility of being, don't worry about thinking about leadership. And then the others saying, yes, you know, there'll be different styles of leadership, et cetera, but there are certain concepts and skills of leadership that can be taught, and how the individual uses them, and then, of course, how you use them differently. You use them differently if you're talking with an issue in healthcare practice in the community where you have a role or responsibility than if you're on a national study committee in a professional group. You're in sociology, or you're in psychology, you're in education, you're in nursing, whatever. There, your pattern of leadership is different, obviously, than you're working here. So, but the skills and the basics are not much different. They're not much different. So we began to support the concept of leadership in academic institutions. And then, of course, the whole relationship of concerns for leadership in the broad field of philanthropy is another interesting issue. Indiana University, with its Center on Philanthropy, is still the premier, the model internationally. And I never served on their board, but they had a small advisory group. And so Kellogg was a major funder. The key funder was the Lilly Endowment. And then there was the anonymous donor, the Atlantic, what do they call it, the Atlantic?
Atlantic Philanthropies.
The Atlantic Group, yeah. Anyway, and Kellogg was one of those partners with Indiana. So there's Russ Mawby saying, gee, what about Michigan? You know, they're close by, but they aren't Michigan. So we began, I always had a pattern. I always was on a first name basis with the presidents of certain institutions, Michigan, University of Michigan, Michigan State, Western, some others, and some of the private institutions, just to keep engaged. It was a professional on the staff to be working on details. I was always concerned that our assistants to, let's say, the University of Michigan need to be also consistent, maybe in the College of Medicine or in the Department of X, but it somehow needs to be consistent with the leadership of the institution. And that's where I would just keep in touch with whoever was there. So tried to develop then the concept of philanthropy in the institutions, and finally ended up, and didn't get much response. We began to get engagement from specific faculty. The University of Michigan, or Michigan State University, I think, was involved in the longitudinal study of the Youth Advisory Council to see how they differ from the non-participants in YAC. But we didn't get response up to the level to create a center which has to cross over, in my judgment, every college. You can't leave any of them out ultimately, because it needs to be a part of an understanding of the three sectors. Wherever I end up, in government or business or in the nonprofit sector, I need to be knowledgeable about the nonprofit sector. So finally called a meeting and invited all the public and all of the private colleges to it. And we had a big turnout. And just in a general talk, I had a presentation by Indiana University of conceptually how they were engaged. The uniqueness there is that they have adjunct professors in law and business and medicine, as well as in social studies and so forth. And that's what we're working on here at Grand Valley State, to get that kind of engagement of faculty and undergraduate students and graduate students, and that will happen. But it's interesting, out of that whole group, and the University of Michigan was there, and Michigan State was there, and so on, one person rose to respond, and that was Lubbers, Grand Valley State. That's why we're here.
That's wonderful.
It's wonderful. And it's a remarkable start, because it's very young, you know, in terms of academic institutions and structures. But Grand Valley State is, as I look at the 15 public institutions, one of the most creative and responsive to societal changes of our cadre of institutions. So I think the center is at the right place.
That's wonderful.
So that's South Africa, Southern Africa. I should say, when we went to Africa, we went to the Republic of South Africa plus 4 other countries. And that's now been expanded to South Africa to plus 6 other countries because of the natural relationships there. And, but of course, the Republic of South Africa is the big one, both geographically and in terms of resources and structure and so forth. And then the whole leadership issue, I think, is of continuing concern. But the thing, again, I'm delighted, absolutely delighted, that the Council of Michigan Foundations and the Michigan Nonprofit Association, and now we haven't talked about the Michigan Community Service Commission, but all of them are partners with the Johnson Center on Philanthropy at Grand Valley State, so that they're working collaboratively. Each of them has a specific and major role, but they realize that they're partners in the larger picture. The one thing that I'm struggling with in my own personal philanthropy, which is small, is moving philanthropy into the undergraduate curriculum as just a natural part of being a student, because an engagement beyond self needs to be a part of your practice as a lawyer, or an engineer, or a teacher, or whatever the heck you're doing. And so we've had an interesting program. I don't know that there's another one in the country yet, where there's a pittance for a faculty member to engage a couple of 2 or 3 undergraduate students in a project related to that field, but specifically then to philanthropy. So we're working on that one, and got it going at Grand Valley, but getting it started at Indiana. So they keep saying I ought to support graduate fellowship, and I say, well, why wait?
Yeah.
I don't know. So that's just a little
Well,
personal interest. Yorkville Community Church. It is a
Yorkville.
non-denominational church, so we don't have to respond to anybody outside God's
right.
God's principles.
Thank
The building was built, the sanctuary was built in 1851. I wasn't on that committee.
you. Weren't you?
It was the only one you.
But the basic framework of the sanctuary is just like the barns, 10 by 10 hand-hewn timbers. And the windows are still the same, we've added on and so forth. So it's a small church in our community. And Luann is secretary of the church council. I've got to get her back there for their 4 o'clock meeting. The thing that is interesting, the church council suddenly realized that they were all retired. Not necessarily in their 60s, but they're all retired. So instead of meeting at 7, they now meet at 4.
Terrific.
Social change, yeah. So we go to a little church. And one of the, it's interesting. I had the privilege of attending a national prayer breakfast not quite 100 years ago. One is held on the first Thursday, or is it the second Thursday, of February every year in Washington, D.C. Thought that'd be a great idea for Battle Creek community, because some communities have done this. So 30 years ago, I got together with the Federal Center in Battle Creek and had a little prayer breakfast, interestingly, the Federal Center, but the community was invited, but nobody went. It was essentially employees. And so I knew an ophthalmologist who was also interested in this idea. So I invited the 2 of them to breakfast at Holiday Inn. We talked about Battle Creek Community Prayer Breakfast, the idea. They agreed. We agreed that each of us would identify 5 women and men not from just our church, we knew, and that would be the core committee. And we hold a community prayer breakfast now in early May. The attendance is usually between 1,000 and 1,600 in the Kellogg Arena, and it's become an institution. We'll be holding our 30th or 31st coming up. So it's interesting, and it's hard to quantify the difference that makes. But the thing in planning was that we got acquainted as a group that didn't know each other before. And those are contacts that get you involved with the Haven and Salvation Army and the other things that otherwise might not touch your life. And so that's another one.
Thank you.
But I don't call me a leader.